topic so well. So that allows me to skip the context part of the presentation and go straight to the point. Normally the context takes me half the presentation anyway. So I'll start from the premise. The premise is that on 23rd December 1937, Corneliu Zakodeanu wrote in one of his circulars, and I quote, "The historic mission of our generation is the resolution of the Jewish problem. All our battles over more than 15 years have had this purpose, and all efforts henceforward will have this purpose." At that point in time, Zakodeanu spoke as the leader of Romania's fascist movement, the Legion of the Archangel Michael. At the end of the electoral campaign, it saw it come third in 1937 the elections, which were subsequently invalidated for this very reason. The period of 15 years he was referring to point to the origins of the Legion in the anti-Semitic student movements of the 1920s, specifically 1922, going back 15 years from 1937, which called at the time for the imposition of numerus clausus in Romanian universities, and this was in view of the anticipated voting of the 1923 Constitution, which finally formally sanctioned the emancipation of the Jews in Romania, making Romania the last country in Europe to emancipate its Jewish population. And this period had witnessed a significant change in Cârstocea status. From that, there were local students hooligan at the University of Iași, the mainstream national political leader, on whom an overwhelming majority of young Romanian intellectuals placed their hopes for a radical revolutionary transformation. And thus, my presentation explores the roots of Romanian fascism in the anti-Semitic student movements of the 1920s, and attempt to trace the development of what had initially been local protest students' actions with a limited scope into a nationwide movement which espouses an ideology that can be identified as what Roger Griffin called a genetic form of populist ultranationalism, and thus allowing us to firmly include in the category of fascist organizations. By drawing attention to these developments that antedate the development of the foundation of the Legion, as well as to the competition among various anti-Semitic right-wing formations in Romania, my presentation reveals, on the one hand, the foundational centrality of anti-Semitism in legionary ideology, while at the same time arguing that the movement's anti-Semitic stance was not the only factor which explains popularity in the 1920s. And going to brief presentation of Inter-Romania, which, as you all, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because we all know the situation. It was much more ethnically heterogeneous than the Old Kingdom. Proportion of ethnic Romanians went down from 92.1% in 1910, to 71.8% after the war. The ethnic minorities were mostly concentrated in the newly acquired provinces, and the Jewish minority was no longer the first most numerous, as it had been before the war, but the third most numerous, making up 4.2% of the population, out of which, however, only 30% of them lived in the Old Kingdom and 70% lived in the new provinces. Of which, as you see, Serbia had 7.2% Jews according to the 1930 census, and 10.9% in Bukovina, making Bukovina more similar to the Polish pattern of Jewish demographics in that respect. And as I've mentioned earlier in the comments, I'm not going to insist on this too much either. There were at least 5 distinct different Jewries. To the distinction between the two main groups that you've mentioned in the 19th century, there was a Jewish population in Bukovina that had long been emancipated and enjoyed full equality. There was a population in Bessarabia which was very politically conscious, with both socialism and Zionism well represented. And Transylvania also had a Jewish population which was acculturated to the Hungarian majority, so they regarded themselves as people from relation Magyars of the Jewish faith. Also very important for student anti-Semitism, Jews represented the largest urban ethnic minority. That would become very important in understanding the structural causes of student anti-Semitism. Of course, you're all familiar, and I'm not going to dwell on that either, with the state project of cultural homogenization in Romania. Ilya Vezan wrote an excellent book about that. And this involved, for what is important for this presentation, involved a significant expansion in educational facilities, focused primarily on higher education or universities, in an attempt to educate national elites to replace former elites in the newly acquired provinces, where minorities had been in a dominant position: Hungarians and Germans in Transylvania, Germans in Bukovina, Russians in Bessarabia, and Jews represented quite well in all three. With the land reform of 1919-1921, peasants started having hopes for a better future, so many of them sent their sons to universities. Many of the leaders of the nationalist anti-Semitic organizations that we'll be speaking about came from a rural environment, and therefore perceived the move to the city as alienating and experienced the city as a foreign, hostile environment. This became very important later on for the development of student anti-Semitism. Because of this expansion in university facilities, the system quickly ran against its limits. The dormitories were few, the scholarships were few, the rents in the cities were high, and this appeared even staggering for people coming from a rural environment. As a result, even if the Jewish students were not better off, because they were urban, because they lived at home with their families, they appeared comparatively or relatively richer to the Romanian students, making them into a primary target of frustration of Romanian students. Also, there was clearly an over-representation of Jews with respect to the population in universities. In the 1920s, the decade that's of interest to this presentation, there were 16.4% Jewish students enrolled in all Romanian universities, and this number went up to 30-40% in certain faculties. The reason for this being that the state bureaucracy remained close to ethnic minorities, primarily to Jews, and therefore Jews sought professions in which they stood a better chance for competing with Romanian students, such as liberal professions, and particularly, as I said, pharmacy and medicine. Speaking of the frustration of Romanian students coming from a rural background to the cities to study, one quote from Jan Mozart's autobiography, in which he opens his volume, Kleine Lenin, Wooden Skulls, collection basically of Mozart's articles, is indicative of this feeling. And as you see, what you see in the quote above is pretty much the dichotomy of urban versus rural, of the pure rural Romanian versus the alienated foreign urban dweller that the Legion would continuously employ throughout in its ideology throughout its evolution. And the cities is in this dichotomy always associated with Jews. Once again, some background that we don't need in this context because you all know it. We've spoken about the non-emancipation of Jews at the end of the Russo-Turkish War and achieving independence. We know the fact that it was finally formalized in the Constitution of 1923. I'm just going to skip. And going back to Irina's list of sources of anti-Semitism, and one of the starting premises I use in my analysis and in my PhD was this transference of the problem stuff. And this is partly the scapegoat theory, but I disagree with the scapegoat theory in one important aspect, and that is I don't see the Jew as necessarily just the enemy, just the scapegoat, just the person that's weakened on the margins. I see him as central to and fundamental to Romanian notions of the nation. I see the Jewish nation as a model in terms of as a model nation for developing nations in Central and Eastern Europe, following Julius Leskin in the argument of the 20th century, following Freudian psychoanalysis, which I use extensively in my PhD, and I'll go back to that in the Q&A if you want to, because it's not really related to the topic today, but I just thought I'd love it on it because I really thought Irina's list was great. One element that's new in post-war Romanian anti-Semitism is this notion of Judeo-Bolshevism. Now, it's typically explained away in terms of the zeitgeist, in terms of this is an idea that circulates around Europe at the time. But in the Romanian context, it has two specific conditions which I think should be briefly pointed out. One, the prospect of socialist revolution, which, although it's glossed over by the historiography due to the fact that it never amounted to anything, that eventually the nationalists prevailed in Romania, it should not be, however, disregarded. At the end of the war, there was considerable socialist agitation in Romania, partly sponsored from Russia, and this was obviously linked in cases with the Jewish problem. One of the specific reasons why it was linked with the Jewish problem is completely unrelated to the issue, that the immigrants coming into Arabia from the Ukraine, escaping the civil war in Russia, and the doubly lethal effects of war communism on their occupations, and the pogroms committed by the White Armies. And this influx of refugees was perceived by the Romanian state as a threat, and they were perceived as agents deployed by Moscow to destabilize Romania. Of course, finally, the third final reason why this Judeo-Bolshevism thing came about is the international context and the fact that at some point Romania found itself between two revisionist neighbors who had become Soviet. There was a brief, short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic of Bela Kun. Some brief comments about the two protagonists of my presentation, Scuza and Codreanu, representing two generations of Romanian anti-Semites. Scuza was an dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Iași. On a personal...
Would you actually read this slide?
Yes. He was one of the main promoters in Romanian universities, and he presents a link between the 19th century generation of anti-Semites and the interwar one. He was active both at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, so before the war. He was also active during the interwar period. He's sometimes referred to as the patriarch of Romanian anti-Semitism, the person who formulated in the most elaborate ideological form the Romanian version of anti-Semitism. He was also the founder of the first Romanian party with an explicit anti-Semitic platform. As you can see, the National Democratic Party name immediately sent us to points out to the index in Poland and to Dmowski's formation, which was called which had the same name. And as I said, with regards to Codreanu, he was Codreanu's professor, his mentor, and on a personal note, his godfather. Codreanu, future leader of Romania's interwar fascist movement, the Legion of the Archangel Michael, the Iron Guard, as it also found in the literature. I prefer Legion of the Archangel Michael because chronologically it came before the second denomination. Secondly, when the Iron Guard denomination was established in 1930, it was supposed to be something else. It was supposed to be an umbrella organization of all anti-communist organizations, radical right organizations in Romania. This never happened because nobody had for reasons which we'll see later. And they eventually ended up overlapping, but the Legion of the Archangel Michael was the original denomination. I think that's important. Codreanu was involved, on the other hand, in all the anti-Semitic organizations of the 1920s and always among the main instigators of anti-Semitic violence in Romania. His tactic, his method of propaganda, of agitation against the Jews was significantly different from that of Cuza. And that is extremely relevant for the case in point. I'll add, instead of going on to each university in turn. I mean, you all know before the war, Romania had two universities, Bucharest and Iași. After the war, there were two more were added, Cernăuți and Cluj-Napoca. There were four universities in Romania. Consequently, the number of students expanded from 8,000 and around 8,000 in 1912, 1913 to about 22,000 in 1922, 1923, and to 37,000 in 1929, 1930. So it's a huge increase in the number of students. At the University of Iași, where Cuza and Codreanu activated, Jews actually represented the majority of students coming from Bessarabia. Now, the reasons for students from Bessarabia enrolling primarily at the University of Iași were diverse, but one of them was geographical proximity. Iași is the closest to the province of Bessarabia. The other one is that Bessarabian students received subsidies from the Romanian state for both cafeterias and dormitories, and this was related to a generous admissions policy directed towards Bessarabians, which was indicative of the state centralizing, homogenizing, nationalizing plans for a province that was perceived in Romania as the most backward province of the country. And this was described in the language of the day as the university's, I quote, national duty to open wide their gates to the youth of Bessarabia, which longed for Romanian culture. And of this youth of Bessarabia that longed for Romanian culture, Jews represent actually 44.2%, so more than the ethnic Romanians. And as I mentioned before, with socialism quite well represented in Bessarabia among Jews, many of them were socialists, which went to confirm the stereotype that students already held of Jews being associated with socialism. As a result of the first student congress, which was held in Romania, which was held in Cluj between 4 and 6 September 1920, the delegation from Iași and Cernăuți proposed that Jews be excluded from all student fraternities and student associations, and Codreanu was among the main proponents of this initiative, which was eventually voted. There are two interesting conclusions to be drawn from it. On the one hand, it shows that initially the pattern of student anti-Semitism followed that of the distribution of the Jewish minority. So students from Iași and Cernăuți, places with a significant Jewish minority, proposed that Jews be excluded from the organizations. Bucharest and Cluj, places with less Jews comparatively to Iași and Cernăuți, opposed the initiative. On the other hand, it's also the first example where a radical minority manages to convince the majority to push the majority in a radical direction, because the proposal was eventually accepted, even though the group of students was extremely small at the Congress. Godan was mentioning figures of 100 students out of 5,000. In police reports, it looks like the delegation might have been like 300. But still, it's a minority in the context of a Congress that brought together 5,000 students. And considering that Bucharest was significantly the largest university in the country, had more than 68% of students, this makes sense. So in students from Iași and Cernăuți especially, which was very small, are always a minority in this context, but always a minority that manages to push the majority in a radical direction. Following the exclusion of Jews from student fraternities, various so-called Christian organizations were established, all militating for the imposition of numerus clausus in Romanian universities, and these eventually coalesced in the National Union of Christian Students from Romania, Națională Studenților Creștini din România, established on the 10th of December 1922, a date of extreme importance because it marks the moment of the first nationwide students' riots and student-organized violence against the Jewish colleagues. There had been previous student riots at almost every Romanian university. The primary place where these occurred was the University of Iași, and here I'm emphasizing again the importance of mobilization. It's good to stress structural factors, it's good to stress the role of the legal framework, but it's also a case of it's also important to take into account agency, to take into account the mobilizing influence of certain characters. And here, the fact that both Godan and Cuza were important agitators at the University of Iași is to be noted. On the 10th of December 1922, however, the riots began at the University of Cluj. The immediate trigger event was the fact that students of the University of Medicine, as I said, Jews were quite a significant presence, refused to allow Jews to dissect non-Jewish cadavers, and due to the shortage of cadavers that the riots ensued. They spread throughout the country in all the university centers. They were much more serious than the ones before. Not only were Jews beaten, not allowed to enter classrooms or dormitories, but one of them was killed. From the outset, the National Union of Christian Students declared its opposition to the voting of Jewish emancipation and militating against it. The date of 10 December would consequently be redefined by the nationalist students as the Day of Nationalist Youth. The generation associated with it defined as the generation of 1922. And immediately in the wake of the student riots, the League of National Christian Defense, as I'm going to use the Romanian abbreviation of LANCROT, was established. It was led by Professor A.C. Cuza, and Godan was in charge of the organization of LANC youth at the national level. So this marks the beginning of a brief but very important coexistence between the two as leaders of the first anti-Semitic formation established in the explicitly anti-Semitic party established in Romania. There was, at the level of LANC youth, there is a gradual overlapping leadership to the point in which, at some point, the leadership of UNSCR, the Union of National Christian Students, overlapped almost completely with the leadership of LANC youth. And most of the students who later found the Legion of the Archangel Michael went through these structures, both these structures. Godan himself had been a member of the Association of Law Students at the University of Iași and the founder of the Association of Christian Students at the same organization. He then went on to the national role within LANC youth. However, from the very beginning, the coexistence between the two was not an easy one. Cuza, as a representative of the pre-war generation of anti-Semites, simply wanted a return to the legal discrimination before the war and envisaged the League as a traditional political party activating within the boundaries of the democratic, not exactly liberal, political system. Godan was suspicious of politics in general. He wanted to organize the League as a disciplined movement, functioning according to the principle of direct action and based on unconditional obedience to the leader. From the very outset, Godan was very appreciative of Mussolini's takeover of power in Italy, and definitely had a penchant for fascist ideas. Unlike the student organizations, which were generally tolerated by the authorities, the League was seen as a threat from its establishment. And therefore, in police reports, it is much more closely followed than student organizations, so it's much better to trace down its evolution. The authorities initially banned all league congresses, and the police apparatus responded with its full neutrality to the nationalists contesting this decision. As a result, when considering the legal path to action blocked, Colgan decided to initiate his direct action, and he planned to assassinate 12 people, 6 what he considered representatives of Jewish power, including rabbis, journalists, Jewish politicians, and 6 Romanian politicians which he considered responsible for the voting of the new constitution. The plot was completely fantasy. The students had one revolver for the 6 of them, but it was eventually revealed to the police by one of the 6 students. But the plot brought them, made them into heroes, brought them to national popularity. This kind of propaganda material was distributed in support of the imprisoned students. And well, I could read that on. Can you read that? In Romanian universities, we have between 60–80% Jewish students. And as the students of today are the leaders of tomorrow, that means that the leadership class of the Romanian country will be tomorrow Jewish. And so on. So I mean, all of this propaganda was basically presenting the students in a positive light and always claiming, always, of course, using statistics that, anti-Semites use statistics. I mean, the number of Jews is always overestimated and overemphasized. You can see the sign of the swastika, which is only present on all these publications. You're talking in Germany or independent? Well, it's hard to establish. On the one hand, the first wearing of swastikas in Romania is, the first swastikas worn by students are brought by Colgan from Germany. He goes to Berlin to study anti-Semitic action in Germany and Austria. He finds it poorly organized, doesn't like it, but he does bring back the swastikas to wear as pins. On the other hand, Cuza always claims that he used the swastika before the Germans used it. And I found no indication of this, because the Germans also used the swastika quite early, much earlier than the Nazis, yes. So it's really... Sorry interrupting. But it's important to ask it indeed. So after the acquittal, I mean, the 6 students who plotted, the 5 students, one of them betrayed the plot to the police. He was subsequently shot by one of the other 5. He didn't die, as some of the literature on the Legion claims. He survived. I actually found him later on fighting for the Legion in the mountains in Post-Conflict, but that's another story. So the 5 students were eventually released, and after they were released, Colgan began this constructive work projects which would later become so characteristic of the Legion. The first work camp, as he called it, established at Iași in 1924, producing the bricks for the future dormitory at Râpa Garden, which would eventually be completed only in 1927, and then become a bone of contention between the Legion and the League of National Christian Defense throughout the war period. And also a vegetable garden in Iași, where they were produced the food for the people working on the bricks at Ungheni. The notion behind these constructive work projects was they were supposed to be practical examples of work for the common good, to show the solidarity between intellectuals, peasants, and workers, and also to show that students do not shy away from manual labor. And indeed, while the peasants were initially suspicious at these projects, they viewed them with suspicion, what are these students doing here? They eventually were, reports indicate they were eventually swayed and quite enthusiastic about the fact that the students are carrying out manual labor. However, these developments are not as peaceful as the legionaries made them appear. Anti-Semitic propaganda was carried out at all these meetings for construction work purposes. And military training. Colgan was a graduate of an elite military school, the military academy in Măstărea, and he started implementing some of the principles of his education towards the primary training of youth. And the piece upon his arrest, because the police eventually interrupted the projects, Colgan was arrested along with the students participating in them. And the piece of paper which was found in his pocket at the time of his arrest called for a general meeting in Bessarabia, a general anti-Semitic meeting in Bessarabia, and started with the words for centuries the Christians, all the people of the world, is agonizing and suffering and sorrow under the insult, the whiplash, and the extract of Judas. So, even in this peaceful activities, the omnipresence of the anti-Semitic element is clearly visible. And can you see the swastikas there?
Yes.
Okay. Because there's one on the building on the back. I think that's not that visible. But again, this is 2 images from the brickworks at Ungheni, the vegetable garden, again, the Scogliano at the back of the room in the picture on the right. And this is eventually the construction which was finalized in 1927. During the time in prison, according to Scogliano's memoirs, this was a time when the plans for a new movement crystallized. On the 8th of November 1923, he chose the name for the movement, the Archangel Michael, inspired by a prison icon. Although the plans won't be actualized until 1927, it was envisaged, as he states in his memoirs, from the beginning to be a movement of moral regeneration and rebirth. Following his arrests at the work camp by the police prefect Constantin Manciu, who was held responsible for the persecution of national students, Scogliano decided to take the law in his own hands and shot him on the steps of the Iași courthouse, where he was participating in the trial was acting as defense lawyer in the trial of one of the students prosecuted by Manciu. As a result, and this time it was no longer a plot. This time it was a clear-cut case of murder with obvious premeditation, which was proven by the investigation. And however, the verdict was not so clear-cut. There was once again a massive mobilizing effort on behalf of both the Union of National Christian Students and of the League of National Christian Defense in support of Scogliano. And interestingly, instead of meaning a long-term imprisonment at the end of his political career, it was the murder that brought him to nationwide popularity. This is one example of postcards. Postcards were a very common means of propaganda, and they were quite widely distributed, showing Scogliano on the front, and again an anti-Semitic text on the back with the stamp of the League of National Christian Defense, its Chisinau branch. So from West Arabia, I took the liberty of applying the stamp. The stamp wasn't there, but there was an individual picture. That's the first stamp showing Scogliano as the hero of the student body. This is another example. I find it interesting how they managed to make it. The poster over there was a poster generated for Easter 1925. It was something that the peasants were supposed to put on their walls for Easter. And it's interesting how they make the swastika into a symbol that recalls a peasant motif. And of course, on the other side of the propaganda machine, there were depictions of Jews as degenerates and so on. I mean, we're quite familiar with these from various anti-Semitic publications, so no need to expand on that. Eventually, Scogliano was acquitted, in spite of the fact that his trial was moved twice by the government. And here, I again take issue with some of the literature which claims government complicity in his acquittal. I doubt this because the government moved the trial first from Iași to Focșani and then from Focșani to Turnul Severin in an attempt to sort of avoid this massive popularity of Scogliano and to sort of obtain a genuine verdict. If the government would have been interested from the very beginning of the acquittal, there was no reason to move the trial from Iași. Iași was already popular, so it would have been easier to get an acquittal there. So I argue that the government was not necessarily complicitous in the trial, only that it eventually bowed to public pressure. When the Liberal government, which feared that its political forces were fading, realized that there's indeed a massive wave of public support in favor of Scogliano, they bowed down, so they accepted the public pressure and went along with it. At the end of the trial, Scogliano was extremely, after his acquittal, he was extremely popular. Well, I think you know the story. That's a picture from his wedding. 5 minutes, okay.
Take up later points for discussion.
Eventually, so this period, the 1920s, witnessed a general escalation of violence against the Jewish population, particularly against Jewish students. Student congresses became no longer just student congresses, but all of them started to be associated with pogroms. The one at Romanian in 1927 being the biggest one and the best known. Articles in international press started remarking the peculiarity of Romanian anti-Semitism, where the heroes of pogroms are not, as in Russia, some uncultivated peasants, but university professors and students. This, I would argue, is not exactly a peculiarity of Romanian anti-Semitism. Student anti-Semitism existed throughout Central and Eastern Europe. What I argue instead is that it's only in Romania that out of these student organizations grew a proper native fascist movement. Nowhere else did these crystallize in actually a fascist movement. Kodama eventually elevated the violence from the level of street practice to the level of principle, and establishing paramilitary formations. And the police report from 1928 thus notes that while Kuz asks for tactical propaganda and the gradual agitation of the masses, Kodano asks for the adoption from the very beginning of the tactical violence against Jews. Eventually, the difference between the two led to a final split and the establishment of the Legion of the Archangel Michael on 24th of June 1927, the original founders being the five brothers I've talked about before. In the space of a decade, the Legion became a mass group of the third largest fascist organization in Europe. Actually, Armin looked at the figures of membership before taking power, and in looking at the figures of membership before taking power, the legionary movement ranks both before the NSDAP and the Italian fascists. It was no imitation of German or Italian fascism, but had a clearly autochthonous or native character, which the legionaries themselves were keen to emphasize over and over again, proclaiming their superiority over both German National Socialism and Italian fascism. They understood their project as a Anti-Semitic project aimed at the spiritual revolution, and always emphasized the anti-materialism which made them opposed not only internationally to German, Italian versions of fascism, internally to the League of National Christian Defense, which gradually, although in the beginning, in the late 1920s, Colano saw the Legion as supporting the activity of the League, and negotiations for a merger between the two began until 1933, when Cusa offered Colano the position of leader to the Storm Battalions, but Colano wanted the position of Secretary General, and he found he was indignated by the offer of leadership of the Storm Battalions. So the all negotiations broke down after 1933, and the two movements eventually became bitter enemies. The dichotomy of old and new, or the conflict between the young and the old generation, is a constant in legionary rhetoric. And it was, on the one hand, used to distinguish itself from the League of National Christian Defense, which was perceived as being linked in with the old generation of Romanian anti-Semites. On the other hand, it was a meeting ground with the young generation of Romanian intellectuals who were themselves looking to define themselves in opposition to the old generations. And in turn, the attraction of the Romanian intellectuals to the Legion was pivotal for its popularity among students. As a result, while between 1927 and 1930 we see the Legion stagnating, particularly in the context of the popularity that the National Peasant Party is enjoying at this time, in the 1930s the Legion witnessed a huge surge in popularity, whereas the League of National Christian Defense stagnated. There's a picture of the leadership of the National Union of Christian Students of Romania in 1935, with some of the prominent legionaries pointed out in the front row. Here's a picture from Cuzi's paper, so from a paper issued by the League of National Christian Defense, criticizing Codano. The title of the article is "You're Mistaken, Mr. Codano," and the picture over there shows students, nationalist students quarreling, one belonging to the League, the other one to the Legion, by the signs they were their arms, while the Jews are laughing at them and basically enjoying this squabbles between them. And the call was for a reunification of the nationalist project, but this was in the context in which, in 1935, Cuza knew that the student organizations were firmly under the control of the Legion. Picture of Codano entering parliament, the one next to him is Branko Tiga, the leader of the Bucharest Student Center. And I think this is the conclusion, yes. So eventually established, a movement established by 5 students. 5 minutes still, for the conclusion.
No. No.
So, I guess from the presentation, although I skipped important parts of it, I guess you get the point that the roots of the Legion were in student organizations. That all of it, that its initial group of founders and the first people who joined the Legion, in 1929 it only had about 400 members, so it was, as I said, from 1927 to 1929 was a period of stagnation for it. The initial people who were attracted to the Legion were students. And eventually, in the 1930s, it came to enjoy the overwhelming support of Romanian students, who proudly self-identified as the backbone of the Legion. This popularity is important to take into consider in the context of the proliferation of radical right organizations in the 1930s. By the early 1930s, the Legion and the League of National Christian Defense were no longer the only radical right organizations. There was a plethora of them. Siguranza Synthesis report from 1936, speaking about the year 1935, mentions a total of 15 extreme right or radical right organizations. And it's important to consider the fact that the Legion managed to attract most students in the context of the fact that it was the one least able to offer any material rewards for it. For example, the Front Romanesque, Romanian Front, an organization established by Salvador Raul, offered the students who joined its assault battalions free places in dormitories. The Legion was never able to offer any kind of material reward. And I get this point from my wife, who always tells me to follow the money in my historical analysis, because that's what she does in her research. And what I do in my analysis is follow the money and find out that the Legion manages to win in spite of not having any. So here's a comment. Eventually, a report of Siguranza from 1935 noted that out of the 42 local chapters of the Union of National Christian Students, 37 were controlled by the legionary movement and only 5 by LAC. This shows a clear reverse of the situation prevalent in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, where the LAC was a major partner and the legionary movement was a very junior partner to the League. As a result of this popularity of the Legion, what we witnessed in the 1930s is a continuous radicalization of anti-Semitism, because the version that the legionary movements proposed was always more radical and always more. I had a call here, but I don't think I'll ever be able to find it now, because they viewed the resolution of the Jewish question and using the explicit words in the context of a fascist authoritarian state. So this is not terminology that we use for the Legion system, terminology that they use themselves, which is something I like to do in researching them, taking their self-definitions and values seriously, again, in line with the new consensus in fascist studies. As a result, the demands, while in the 20s you had demands for numerus clausus, in the 1930s the legionary students were putting forth demands for numerus nullus, so for a complete exclusion of Jews from universities. At the last student congress in Târgu Mureș, and I think you'll know once again, the last student congress punishment teams of students were established and assigned 10 targets among Romanian politicians, one of them being the king's Jewish mistress, and another Pescu, which was a bad thing to do for the Legion, as it eventually led to the king's wrath and to the destruction of the movement. So, to conclude, and because Idan told me my time is up, I will argue that development of Romanian student anti-Semitism is typical of developments in Central and Eastern Europe, but on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, nowhere else did the student organizations develop into a fascist movement who had a real bid for political power. And the other thing I will argue is the foundational centrality of anti-Semitism in legionary ideology, which is something I've dealt with in my PhD thesis. It's a topic, basically. While at the same time distinguishing it from the Nazi version, while being as radical and as comprehensive as the Nazi version of anti-Semitism, I argue it was based on cultural and religious grounds rather than racial, biological ones. Thank you.
Can I ask the obvious question?
Yep.
Why, in fact, was the student movement in Romania so much stronger than the equivalent movements elsewhere?
Well, here's where I see the role of mobilization as being very important, and the capacity of the leadership to mobilize it, and also because nowhere else were they so explicitly fascist, and nowhere else. I mean, I find this the fact that the legionary movement was so explicitly fascist is one of the reasons for the attraction of the students to its cause. Is one answer. The second answer is related to what Irina listed as the socialism of fools. Mm. The weakness of the left in Romania meant that any people attracted in any way to radical solutions only had a radical right solution to subscribe to. And in many ways, many of the features of the Legion parallel features which you find with communist organizations elsewhere. But since these were extremely weak in Romania, many of those people who normally join extreme left organizations came to the extreme right. One classic example being Haile Selassie, one of the good journalists writing for the Legion, who was a socialist and a communist actually, and then switched to the legionary movement in the 1930s.
And the radical right was not up in the shoots, not strong.
The radical right was very strong. So in the 1930s, it's not just the students, not just the Legion, not just the League, but a whole number of radical right formations. But these don't develop, they don't grow, because there are already these two poles of attraction. I argue from 1933 onwards, just one pole of attraction, which basically sucks away the radical right's vote and mobilization from the other groups.